Have you ever wondered what would have happened if it had been three wise women instead of three wise men that came to see Jesus that night? Some have suggested, and this isn't me, okay, but some have suggested that if it had in fact been three wise women, they certainly would have asked for directions much earlier instead of needing to go to King Herod's temple. Some have suggested that they definitely would have arrived on time rather than 2 years late, and had likely helped to deliver the baby. Some have suggested that they would have come and likely cleaned the place, brought practical gifts for the family to eat, likely a casserole, rather than these very impractical gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And finally, without a doubt, if it had been three wise women, there definitely would have been peace on earth that night. Do you know, I have always been fascinated with stars. I remember when I was 8 or 9 years old, one Christmas my parents said, "What do you want for Christmas?" And I said, I would love a telescope. And I ended up getting one that Christmas, and even though it wasn't a very powerful one, I would spend hours in my backyard staring up at the craters in the moon and looking at these far-off twinkling lights with my telescope. As Pumbaa says in The Lion King, stars are so much more than just balls of gas burning billions of miles away. Stars, as we know, are the suns of other galaxies, and they are so bright that we can see them, even though they are millions and billions, and in some cases, trillions of miles away. Well, this morning we're going to be looking at the story of the Magi, or the wise men as we have come to know them. And what we're going to discover is that these men may have not intimately known God, but they knew the stars. They knew the night sky. They knew the constellations. They understood the relationship between the moon and the tidal systems. They would spend their nights staring up and studying the stars. And they would have noticed if something significant had changed in the night sky. And one night, something did change. Maybe it started off as a normal night, just like every other night. But soon they realized that something extraordinary was happening when they looked up and saw this. They saw a star, and it was a new star, and it wasn't there the day before. And they took note, and they investigated, and they conferred with one another. And what they didn't understand about why that star was there, it captured their imagination. In fact, the Magi were open to the idea that this new star might actually represent that God was doing something special in their world. And this morning we're going to explore their story and try to figure out how that light in the sky led them to the real King of Kings. Before we dive into the story, though, I want us to spend a few minutes looking at the main characters in this story. In verse 1, we're introduced to a fairly major character in the Christmas story known as King Herod. And where Scripture refers to him as King Herod, that's how we know him. The rest of the world back then knew him as Herod the Great. And we know from history that he lived from 73 BC to 4 BC. We also know that he was made king of this area that was known as Judea by the Romans. And his political career actually started at the age of 25 when he was named the governor of Galilee. And this was actually a very high position for somebody who was only 25 years old. The Romans were hoping that Herod could actually control the Jews that were living in that area. In fact, we know that in the year 40 BC, the Roman Senate gave him the title of King of the Jews. And it was a title that the Jews hated because Herod was anything but religious. And this might help to explain why when the Magi came before him, saying that they were looking for the King of the Jews, that he reacted the way he did. Herod was probably best known to the world back then for his colossal building projects in Jerusalem and other parts of the ancient world. His most famous project was the rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, sometimes even referred to as Herod's Temple. He also built the fortress in Herodion, which was probably the fortress where John the Baptist was held by Herod's son, who would later be in power as well. And this Herod is also credited with building the mountain fortress of Masada and the seaport in Caesarea. But Herod was also known as being this very insecure and paranoid leader, and he would often see a threat and a conspiracy around every corner. We know that he was married 10 times, yes, 10 times, and was even known to execute his wives if he suspected them of treason, which happened on 4 different occasions. But it wasn't just his wives that got the best of his paranoia, because Herod also was known to execute his sons when he suspected them of conspiring against him. Interestingly enough, though, history tells us that Herod actually at one point even converted to Judaism, although none of the real Jews at that time ever believed that it was a sincere conversion. He was this powerful, powerful man. And as power sometimes does to powerful men, that power ended up being his downfall. As I was researching this sermon, one author that I was reading said that there were 4 things that really characterized Herod's reign. Herod had a preoccupation with power. He had a preoccupation with possessions. He had a preoccupation with prestige. And he had a preoccupation with paranoia. Now, with that as the background, let's fast forward for a moment to the final moments of Herod's life. Because Herod the Great, this Roman-appointed king of the Jews, is slowly dying of a disease that many people believed was a form of cancer. His body was racked with pain. He was having hourly convulsions. His skin was covered with open sores, and he's rapidly losing his mind. But he's still the Roman-appointed king of the Jews. And then one day, word comes to him in Jerusalem that some visitors have arrived from the east, and these visitors were the wise men. And the wise men, or the Magi, if they've come to be known, have an interesting backstory of their own. They were actually the court advisors to the king of Persia and descendants of the Babylonian wise men. Now, I need to give you a bit of a history lesson here that I think will help us to understand this story a little bit better. At the time of the birth of Christ, the 2 most powerful empires in the world were the Roman and the Persian. Now, the Romans had conquered the Greek Empire and taken over the western territories that had been won by Alexander the Great. The Persians, on the other hand, had conquered the eastern lands, the former Persian Empire that had previously been ruled by the Babylonians. You may remember hearing that from your Sunday school classes when you were younger. Now, about 60-some years before the birth of Christ, the Romans defeated the Persians for control over what we call the ancient Near East. So it's the landmass that includes Israel, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem, all the areas where the Christmas story plays out. And this was only a few hundred miles from the Persian border. So the Persian capital changed location several times throughout its history, and most likely the wise men in this story came from the capital city, somewhere towards the northern part of their empire. So the logical question would be this: why would these Persian people care about a promised Jewish Messiah, right? Why would they care? Well, to understand that, and it is significant to our understanding, let me talk just a minute about Jewish, Babylonian, and Persian history. And please stick with me. I'm going to make this quick. But in 605 BC, the nation of Israel was overrun by the Babylonians, and many of the nation's brightest and best were dragged off into captivity. And most were settled in a refugee camp outside of the capital of Babylon. But some of those were brought into the Babylonian court and assimilated into the ruling Babylonian culture. One of those brought to the court was a young man named Daniel. Remember him? And Daniel, with the help of God, became the chief or the ruler of the Babylonian wise men just 3 years later. You can read about that in Daniel chapter 2. We're told that Daniel lived a long life, and he was part of this royal court for the next 66 years of his life. So he lived to be at least 85 years old and served in the Babylonian and Persian kingdoms from 605 to 535 BC. So when Jerusalem initially fell to the Babylonians, over the next 20 years, the tiny nation continued to rebel, and every time it did, a Babylonian army would come, enter the country, and round up more and more and more Israelites to take them into exile. As a result of that, these little pockets of Jewish communities got planted throughout the Babylonian Empire. And with these communities really came their scriptures as well. So in Daniel 2, verse 48, we read this. It says, "Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon." And then this is important. "And placed him in charge of all its wise men." So my point in giving you this history lesson is to try and paint this picture of who these wise men actually were. These wise men knew about the Messiah's coming because Daniel and his community of Jewish exiles would have had scrolls, the Old Testament scrolls, with them. And the Old Testament had a lot to say about this promised Messiah. In Genesis 3:15, it indicates that the Messiah would be born to a woman. So the wise men came looking for a newly born baby to a woman. In Daniel 7:13, it speaks of a Messiah that will be both God and man. In Numbers 24:17, it talks about a star rising in Israel. And I could go on and on about the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. But where this gets really interesting is that one of the subjects that all of these wise men would extensively study in school was how to read the stars. And they were known as being great astronomers. And part of their belief was that God would and did communicate to them by means of star alignments and configurations. And according to their thinking, people and nations were associated with different stars and different constellations. So the nation of Israel was associated with the constellation that we know as Pisces. And the symbol for Pisces, as you might know, is a fish. And they associated the nation of Israel with the fish because centuries earlier, God had sent a prophet Jonah to this same group of people, and he was delivered to them by a huge fish who spat him up onto dry land just outside the city of Nineveh. So because of that story, these wise men had always associated the nation of Israel with the symbol of the fish, or with the constellation known as Pisces. So understand this. At the birth of Christ, something happened in the constellation of Pisces that communicated to these Persian wise men that the promised Messiah, or the real King of the Jews, had in fact been born. And that is in fact where we pick up this story, because the wise men saw this star. They put two and two together, and they determined that there was something that they needed to investigate here. So they packed up their camels and their donkeys, and they enlisted a few dozen servants, and they traveled to the capital city of the Jewish faith at that time, which was Jerusalem. You likely already know this, but we really have no idea how many wise men there actually were, but there were likely a lot more than 3 of them. In fact, early traditions say that there were anywhere between 12 and 14, but we really have no clue. You know, after centuries of telling this story, people started to refer to the three wise men to correspond with the 3 gifts that they brought with them. But make no mistake, these men were highly motivated to find this child. So motivated, in fact, that they were willing to embark on what was likely a treacherous 1,000-mile journey across the desert. And all they really knew was that a baby had been born, but they didn't know where. They knew that he was a king, but they didn't know his name. And all they had to go on was these prophecies and the star in the sky that was leading them. So when we pick up this story in Matthew chapter 2, they've just arrived in the city of Jerusalem after what could have been a 2-year journey for them. And it actually makes sense that they went directly to Jerusalem first, because they wanted to welcome the King of the Jews. But there was a huge surprise waiting for them when they got there. So the story starts in verse 1, and we read, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?' We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." So they arrive in Jerusalem and they go directly to King Herod's palace. I mean, where else would you expect to find a king, right? And when they get their audience with King Herod, they ask this dying, paranoid king a question that literally shakes him to his very core. If you think about it, the Magi likely assumed that the newborn king was the actual son of King Herod the Great, the current king of the Jews. And they likely believed that everyone already knew about this baby. So their question made perfect sense. Where is the one who has been born king of the Jews? And so if you're Herod, what are you thinking? His first logical question was this: what would make you think that there is a new king of the Jews? I'm still here. I'm not dead yet. And being very ill and almost at the end of his life, you can almost smell the paranoia kicking in at this moment. And he's likely thinking, somebody's already gunning for my job and I'm not even dead yet. Someone's after my King of the Jews title. Someone's out to overthrow me. But then the wise men continue and they say that we saw this star when it rose and have come to worship him. So Herod's response is recorded in verse 3 and 4. And we're told that when Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. It's fascinating because the word disturbed that's used here in this passage is such an interesting, deep, and rich word that actually means to shake violently. And some have wondered if this had to do with the illness that he had and maybe the seizures that were resulting from it. But this verse says that it was the actual news that the Magi brought that was causing him to shake. Or it was the news that was upsetting him so much that he was actually having convulsions. And it wasn't just him shaking, but it says that all of Jerusalem was shaking too, because no one knew what this psycho was going to do next. So he starts to do his homework, and he pulls together those people who can come and help him to fill in the gaps. He asks the Jewish religious community, who are these Magi? What are they talking about? Why are they here? What are they looking for? And this is what this group of religious leaders in the Jewish community say to this paranoid, dying, Roman-appointed king of the Jews. He says, "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Now, Herod's Jewish advisors have just quoted a couple of verses from Micah chapter 5. And they go on to explain that this passage and that there's a number of other Old Testament prophecies that have led this group of Persian wise men to Jerusalem. Herod was likely feeling even more threatened, and this is where his paranoia really kicks into high gear. And in verse 7 it says, "Then Herod called the Magi secretly found out from them the exact time that the star appeared." Now you might say, why is that significant? Well, Herod wanted to know the exact time the star appeared because he wanted to know the exact age of the child. And when he heard what he needed, he lied to the Magi. He said in verse 8, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for this child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." And off the Magi went. The star that had led them almost 1,000 miles across the desert reappeared in the sky, and this time it led them to the exact house that Jesus was in. In fact, as Matthew continues in the second half of verse 9, the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. So interesting to note here that Jesus wasn't a baby anymore. In fact, at this point, Jesus was likely around 2 years old. Verse 9 says that the star stopped over the place where the child was. And this word in the original language is used to describe a toddler, not a newborn baby. Also in verse 10, it mentions that they came to the house where the child was. And Jesus and his parents were obviously back home by this time, by the time the wise men showed up. And so all those cute little nativity scenes you have in your home with the wise men there right beside the shepherds, I hate to break the news to you, but nope, that's not the way it happened. But you know, I just love verse 11 and how it records the raw emotion in this moment. It says, on coming into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented them to him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. You know, I find it so interesting that they chose these gifts. If your friend or family member, maybe a neighbor, was having a child, it's customary in our culture to give a gift, right? I mean, maybe baby clothes, maybe some toys for the child to play with, maybe a blanket, maybe a casserole. But you know, the culture back then had a tradition too, and they would bring either a homespun blanket or they would bring food for the family. But what these wise men were doing was they were bringing a very different kind of gift, because they were bringing the kinds of gift that you would bring to a royal family when a prince or a princess or a future king would be born. You know, they understood something about this baby that Herod would never understand. That this baby was destined to be a very different kind of royalty. And they brought him gold. Now, even back then, gold was one of the rarest and most expensive metals. It represented the wealth and power of a king. They brought him frankincense, and this was an oil that was used in the temple, and it was an important part of the worship to God. And it was used to show reverence and to acknowledge God's holiness. They brought him myrrh, and this was a kind of perfume that is actually made from the leaves of a rose. And after a person died, myrrh was used to anoint the body and to prepare it for burial. In fact, in John 19:39, it tells us that after Jesus died, his body was wrapped in linen along with 45 pounds of myrrh and other spices. We're told that when they came into the house that they fell on their knees and they bowed down. And all they could do was to express the raw emotion that they were feeling at that moment. And they worshiped him. I mean, can you imagine from their vantage point the journey for these men that had started years earlier when they were just on one normal night looking up at the sky? They were looking at the night sky. They were staring at the constellations. They were studying the stars. Except this night was different. This night they saw something that they had never seen before. And from that night to this night, where here they were, their long search had brought them to this house to meet this 2-year-old boy who was destined to become the real King of the Jews and the King of Kings. We're then told that the wise men and Joseph both had dreams. The first dream is recorded in verse 12, and we're told that, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they, that being the Magi, returned to their country by another route. The second dream is recorded in verse 13, and it says that when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "and take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." And you know what? Herod, this Roman appointed king of the Jews, did search until his very dying breath. Keeping in mind that Mary and Joseph were likely very poor, how do you think that they could afford to just obediently respond to this dream? Do you think they could just drop everything and start a new life somewhere else? How do you think they could survive in a foreign country where they'd live as strangers with no family or no immediate source of income? What do you suppose Mary and Joseph used for money on their trip? Well, one of the beautiful parts of God's master plan is he had just provided them with what would be equivalent to 8 years of a good salary in the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh. And that's the story. That's the story of the wise men that came that night. You know, I want to close this morning with another story, and this is the story of one of the greatest minds, I believe anyways, of the 20th century. In 1948, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature and was known worldwide for his poetry, and his name was T.S. Eliot. And although he was born in America, he spent most of his life in England and later became a British citizen. And in his search for truth, he became a very cynical humanist and actually edited a magazine that was called The Egotist. And in many of his early poems, Eliot used to ridicule Christianity. But something happened to him in 1927. At the age of 39, Eliot turned to Christ after seriously studying Scripture. He was baptized and actually became one of the greatest spokesmen for the intellectual viability of Christianity. And not long after becoming a Christian, Eliot put his personal testimony into a poem that he called The Journey of the Magi. And in it, Eliot writes from the perspective of one of the wise men, reflecting back on the life-changing quest. And as he's doing that, he's really writing his own spiritual quest as well. And the poem begins, "A hard time we had of it. At the end we preferred to travel at night, sleeping in snatches with the voices in our ears saying, 'This is all folly. This makes no sense. Turn back now.'" He later writes, "Then when we came to the tavern with the vine leaves over the lintel," that was a reference to the Passover lamb whose life-giving blood placed on the lintel is like a new wine. He eventually says, "And we eventually arrived that evening, not a moment too soon, finding the place. It was you, it was you, it was you." I don't want to recite the whole poem. It's quite long. I'd encourage you to go home and Google it. But you know, it concludes by admitting that his old way of living had to die because it was rendered worthless after his encounter with this baby Jesus. His new birth was death to his old self. You know, Eliot would later say, you know, like the wise men, I searched a long time for the truth. I searched for a long time to figure out God. And when I finally discovered Jesus, I found that truth that I had been looking for. And that truth changed my life. You know, I don't know where you're at in your journey with Jesus this morning. Maybe some of you are still on that journey to find him. Maybe you're like the wise men, and maybe you've had your aha moment because you've seen your equivalent to the star. Maybe you're like them and your journey's been long and it's been filled with these long periods of wandering and with doubt. You know, wherever you are at in your journey this morning, my prayer for you is that our journeys will be to find Jesus, and that when we do find him, that our raw emotion will be that of the Magi, in that we will know of nothing else to do but to bow down and worship the true King of Kings.